A lot of all this began for me when I was young, about the age of 3. Some of my first experiences with spirit. My mother and grandmother were quite interested with the Ouija board and the occult, and they were practicing a lot of this in the home where I was growing up. And I actually lived in a street for about 8 years when it was quite an abandoned street and there was a lot of spirits. I come from a place in South Australia called Woomera. It's in the far north of South Australia. And there was quite a lot of Aboriginal spirits around at that time, and a lot of occult activity in the town, and people coming up through the 70s were quite interested in that. So my mother and my grandmother decided that they would start, dabbling in the occult and the Ouija board. And for me, at such a young age, at 3, I had these 3 entities that used to appear to me in my bedroom, and my mother would come in, and she would quite often find me discussing and sitting there and talking and laughing with them. And I asked her about these entities, these beings that were appearing, and she had said to me that I didn't look frightened or scared, that I would just sit there and as a 3-year-old's language, would be talking and laughing and communicating with them. So my first experience of this, I felt, as I've gone back and done some regression work, these were 3 guides that stepped in from a very young age for me, and they're still with me today. And these guides have been very crucial in keeping me protected, and as I will share with you a bit later on, some of the things that have happened to me as I've gotten older were very crucial in terms of me actually stepping out life and death situations to where I could have actually been, my life could have been taken on numerous occasions, not just through the things that have happened by my own choices, but by people that I was surrounded with as well. So from that age was the first encounter that I had, and the information that I got around that was coming from my mother. As I got older, she did inform me how my grandmother and my mother continued to dabble and play with the occult, and spirits continued to step in our houses as we moved around the town. There was a lot of dark forces at that time, and a lot of people were having issues with violence, death, drugs and alcohol in Woomera, and a lot of this was attributed to the spirits and the Aboriginal spirits that were in that area. When I did further research around this, I found that the land actually hadn't been given permission and the people there to build on it. If any of you know about Woomera, they used to launch rockets from there in the 60s, right? So my family was there from pretty much the get-go. My mother's grandfather was an engineer out on the range.
A lot of UFO reports from nearby.
There was, and there was an incident where he actually found a silver spear out on one of the range, on Range E, I believe, that they had tracked and located a spear that had come from outer space, which has now been archived. But yeah, and they're still doing research into that today. It's interesting enough that my mother's grandfather was quite religious, and for my mother and my grandfather to step into the occult world and the spirit world was quite the opposite experience for him. So I do believe that they found that to be a bit of a conflict as they were moving forward as a family. So for me, that was my first experience, and my experience of guides working with me and guiding me. I've always felt a presence from spirit as I've been growing up. From about the age of 13, I started to encounter more spirits around me. My family situation and how I was growing up was quite dysfunctional. And growing up with a mother who had suffered from bulimia, anorexia, medication problems, drinking, emotional problems. As I've just discovered in the last few weeks with this, is that what I will talk about in the second half of this today is that she has been under the influence of a lot of dark forces and entities, creatures and different types of beings that actually can penetrate the astral bodies and actually move into our physical bodies, the mental and the emotional and like I said, the physical aspects of our being. So today my presentation and my talk is primarily around my experiences with spirit, how I've had some of these things happen to me, and just recently through one of my teachers who works with the Syrian Command has actually been able to go in and locate these entities and these beings and actually clear them for me, which I've noticed just in the last 4 to 6 weeks has made a tremendous impact on my emotional and my mental health and my energetic well-being. So most of us do carry these, and we do pick them up along the way. And I really feel today, you know, it's important, and again being here today and discussing this with you, how many of us are actually aware and attribute some of the issues that we have to some of these forces that actually influence us from the other side. Okay, so discarnate and incarnate entities, you know, as you know, one is in body and one is out of body. And for me at 13, I started to experience a lot of emotional issues and mental issues. Anxiety was a massive thing for me. And where I lived, and I was safe and secure physically, but I would have these attacks of anxiety all the time. Excuse me. So as I was growing up, I had no idea the influences that I had surrogated or inherited from my mother and my grandmother, actually dabbling in the Ouija and the dark forces that had actually stepped in around us. And at that age, I don't believe, though, that they had actually penetrated into my energetic field, but they were certainly influencing me emotionally at that time. I wasn't aware of how far or how much my mother had been influenced by this. And one of the things that my teacher has described to me, that there's three reasons, or three primarily important factors in when we can overcome and really influenced by these dark forces. So if we're not energetically integral, what tends to happen is our auric field can get pinholes in it, tears and rips, and they can step in. So it's a vibrational match, as all you are probably aware of how the vibrations will match. But they do look for that, and a lot of these entities do look for sustaining life force energy to keep them alive and sustained in their state of being. So my mother had taken on these entities through alcohol addiction, medication addiction, eating disorders, and she had become quite influenced by this. Her emotional and mental state of being was fluctuating all the time, and she was struggling to move forward in her life. And even to this day, just recently, she still battles with all these issues. It'll be interesting to see this clearing that was done for her a couple of weeks ago, how well she's travelling. I do check in, but we're just going to see how that plays out. So at 13, for me, that's where I started to notice my emotional disorders were really starting to kick in. By the time I was 18, I had become full-fledged alcoholic, and I had become susceptible and open. At 18, more forces started to influence me, and I had a near-death experience at 18 where I was in a car crash, and that nearly claimed my life. I was very lucky. And at that time, I truly believed that this is where my guides had interceded. When we went back and looked at how the accident occurred and where the car travelled, between a tree and a gym object that was on a walking trail, there was less than 1 foot clearance either side of the car. And the person that was driving was extremely drunk and under the influence of drugs. And we had managed to pass through that and hit a dirt culvert. I had no seatbelt on. The driver did, and my mate in the back did. Right? And we all managed to get out. I managed to get out unscathed. That incident there, I felt like I had been removed from my body upon impact and then stepped back in. When I got out, I was in a lucid state, and I actually had no recollection of what had happened. And it took me hours before I actually was able to seep back into my body and recall the incidents of what happened. And at that time, I felt a very strong presence around me that had actually encapsulated me in light and energy and saved me from going through the windscreen of the car. I had no belt on. And when we impacted that dirt culvert, we were doing over 80 k's an hour. The driver had his seatbelt on, and his whole face was up against the windscreen, shattered all the bones in his face. We got him to the hospital and so on with that story. But for me, that was one of the first encounters where I had experienced divine protection, angelic protection, and protection from my guide and from my guides. As I moved forward in my life, from 18 to 25, things continually. I was working, I was someone who functioned at a poly level. So I was a high functioning addict with emotional issues and mental issues. All of this stemming back to my childhood and the influences of these entities and these beings that had stepped in. One of the interesting things that I used to discuss with my mum when I would have these lucid moments was she would say to me that these dark forces always had their eye out for me. And there was a war going on for my soul or my spirit. And at that time, it made me feel a little bit anxious and unsure about the gravity of those words when she had spoken to me about that. But at some points, I actually really felt that that's what was going on for me. And I do believe that for each one of us, as we move forward in life, we're actually moving forward with these forces right beside us. And one of the things that my teacher had said to me just recently, which I found quite interesting, was that going back to the time of Christ, when he was carrying that cross, if you could have seen clairvoyantly what was going on in spirit world, the demons that were chained beside him, walking beside him, they serve a purpose and a role in spirit, especially the lower forces and the darker forces. Without that opposite, how would we ever have the opportunity to advance and grow? So we would remain stagnant. So a big part of this learning for me, without fearing, was understanding that, but it's come a lot later in my life now where that clarity is stepping in. So around 21, I had met an individual who was a dark magician who again was playing with these dark forces, who had put curses on me and hexes on me. And again, I was at that point in my life where I was about to lose my mind. I thought I was going insane. My behaviour had become so erratic. I couldn't maintain a job. My relationship with my wife and my children, my child at that time, had become very estranged, and it was a very challenging situation. At the same time that happened, 3 marks appeared on my right hand. They were not bruises or scars, but I had noticed one day that these marks had appeared a few months after I met this individual called Michael, who was a magician, which I found out later down the track, who had been working for the dark forces for a big part of his life. And this is the part where I really started to try and look for answers and understand what was going on in my life and what was going on from the other side and why this was happening to me. As I've discovered now at this point in my life, a big role in my journey, you know, and what I'm opening to at the moment, is learning to become a metaphysician and working in these fields, in these areas with spirit and with these energies. And quite clearly today, standing in front of all of you today and discussing this and working with my teacher is quite, you know, is leading me down that path to actually start, you know, opening up to the possibilities of this, along with my experiences in the past. This has certainly given me weight for the experience of being able to understand what's happening. So these 3 marks appeared on my right hand, and I believe there was a period of time that went past where I was able to understand through the influence of another clairvoyant what was actually going on through a reading, and she had told me about this individual and how he had been putting spells and hexes on me. And we were friends at the time, but I had no idea. And I had gone to this clairvoyant out of desperation to try and figure out what was happening with me mentally and emotionally. And she had seen this person and what he was doing. I described to her about the marks on my body, and funnily enough, there was probably 2 to 3 weeks after that had happened that the marks faded from my right hand and moved to another part of my body. And they're still there today. And I do feel around that with what's happening today with those marks, I thought they were an influence from him. But they're very symbolic of the forces and the guides and the angels that have been working with me from when I was young. 3 guides, 3 marks. At 21, 3. So there's the triune and the power of those numbers. It took me a while to put all the pieces together and figure out what was happening metaphysically to me, let alone energetically. But again, the intercession that happened through that clairvoyant, I was able to start to do the work around releasing and working with those curses and diminishing them. But still I felt that there was a presence with them, and they stayed with me right up until just recently actually. So again, from moving on from there and that experience with what happened with this dark magician and those curses and hexes that he had been placing on me, my spirit guides were still interceding and working with me and keeping me protected. So the little bits of information were stepping in and guiding me. But I was terribly frightened and very distressed, mentally and emotionally. One of the interesting things that had been occurring through my life as well, I do believe, that has been partially a result of these influences and these forces, is that I'm pretty injured from head to toe. And I was at a seminar a few weeks ago, and this lady, Pip Mackay, was talking about archetypes and archetypal influences and how we can use them to work through our emotional trauma and our blocks. But one of the things that she spoke about that really intrigued me was how we actually manifest injury in our body when we think that it's an accident. And I'd always sort of had this intuitive feeling that the accidents and the injuries that had happened to me, and I've had them through sport, car accidents, fighting, there's been several, work injuries, that have all been just a result of my choices, poor choices. But actually they were not. These injuries had been influenced from my subconscious, my energetic fields, from these forces that had actually influenced the choices that I made. They were solely not just mine. I was being influenced into these situations as well as making these choices. It was almost like I was under duress, energetically, emotionally, spiritually. Right, so I would find myself in these situations behaving and doing things that resulted in these injuries. So today, you know, you would look at me and think that I'm quite strong, and I still have a good body, I keep it well, but again, I'm injured from head to toe, back, shoulders, knees, wrists. And a lot of these injuries were resulted, and I attribute them back to the forces and the influences that have played a big role in my life. And I go further back from there, and I recall the words that my mother has said to me, that the war and the fight for your soul has always been on. And I thought, well, if I'm injured and I'm crippled and I collapse under the weight of that pain, how can I serve my highest purpose? How can I serve the light? How can I actually align with my role here on the planet? And it was only through that pain and through those experiences that has brought me into this path and alignment with my truth and what I'm actually supposed to be doing and working in these realms, which the doors are just beginning to open for me now. So it's interesting how some people could take the view, especially with the adversity that I've experienced in my life, and consider that to be a curse or something so tragic. I don't choose to believe in that. I can actually see, again, how my teacher was explaining to me how these demons, dark forces, entities, they play a specific role in our evolution and our growth. Moving forward from there, I bought a house in Kowtowie in the mid-north of South Australia. This area is tribal land, and the Aboriginal spirits there, again, the land has not been blessed and the permission for people to actually build and dwell there. As we've all, you know, in Australia, a lot of that has not been done properly. And so the spirits, the Aboriginal spirits in spirit, are quite unpleased with what we've done to their land and how we've desecrated it, and we've not honoured them and honoured the land. So when I moved to Kowtowie in 2010, the owner of the pub there was quite interesting. The Kowtowie pub had several spirits that were there, and my friend Ben, who I'll talk about just later, that we've done some work with, is highly clairvoyant and sensitive, and he's been able to see spirit all his life. And he would quite often describe to me a young girl of about 8 to 10 named Kowtowie Kate, and she would appear in the hotel, and he would see her walking through the hallways and in the rooms. At that time, the original owner had moved up north to Queensland, and his mother and family took over the lease of the hotel for 3 years, and they would stay there and live there. Carol, his mother, being very clairvoyant and open to all this as well, would see the spirits at this hotel. One of the interesting things around this hotel with Kowtowie Kate, and it was a mining town, and a lot of the miners or railway town, and miners would reside in this town, and there's been several deaths and suicides that occurred there. And some of these spirits that passed over from those occurrences were very dark, very malevolent spirits, and they resided in the pub. And the pub has a cellar, and you would go down in there. This is what I was described to me anyway from Ben and Carol, that on many occasions when Carol would go down there to change the kegs on the taps on the kegs, that objects would fly across the room in the cellar, and she's had some very close calls in terms of being severely hurt. So, interesting enough, my friend Phil, who owns the Kowtowie Hotel, and his wife Anna are very spiritual. And going back to the Aboriginal land just quickly, and we would have discussions quite late at night after we closed the pub, and I would be asking him, because I bought a house right on the back, just on the back side of it, and Kowtowie is very small, there's only probably 20 people there, and there's a main road that goes through to Jamestown. My house was owned by an undertaker, which I didn't know when I bought it, right? I'd come back from America and I saw the house, and the previous owner was a biker, and I really feel that he had a lot of problems that stemmed from the energies in Kowtowie and from that house as well. And he ended up just passing away in his sleep, that rock spin in the mines. But I saw the house and thought, if that ever comes up for sale, I'll buy it. And funny enough, 2 years later, I was meant to be there again. So looking at that, interesting enough, it's like, okay, not just for a home, but there was a greater purpose working in my life for me to learn about these experiences, yeah. So Phil and I would quite often have discussions about the spirits around Kowtowie and the spirits in my house and what was going on. And quite at that time, they weren't malevolent, but they were very present in my home. And one of the first things that came into my awareness with these experiences was I had a friend who was an alcoholic. My best friend's brother, actually, Butch was his name, and there was a band at the pub, and he stayed at my house while I was at my girlfriend's for 3 nights. He was only supposed to be there for 1 night. And the interesting thing, when I came back to check on him the next day to see if he was gone, he said, I can't go, I have to stay. And I said, all right, what are you doing? He said, well, I can see the spirits that have appeared here in your house, and I'm working with them to get them to go and release them to the light. And he had sat in my room for 3 days with my table and had my notepad out and had been writing notes and drawing pictures and symbols with this particular spirit that had passed over, that had attached to the house, and they needed help to actually go to the light. Interesting enough, this individual Butch, to look at him, you would not believe that he was clairvoyant. He had never told anybody, let alone his 5 brothers. I was gobsmacked and thought, oh my God, he goes, don't tell anybody about me. I don't want them to know. So the interesting thing was, he spent time in my house while I was there, working with a spirit, one spirit, old gentleman in particular, getting him to release and go to the light. I had no idea that was what was happening, let alone he had the ability to do that. And when I asked him where he learned this, he had told me that experiences from his childhood had opened him up, and an angel had stepped in and told him what gift he had had and shown him how to do the work. And he said that it was so much for him that he couldn't handle it. And as he grew up, he felt so isolated and alone that he turned to alcohol and drugs. One of the common things that occurs with people who are really sensitive to spirit and they don't understand is they use coping mechanisms to switch it off, dumb it down, numb it out. And I found that that was what I was doing, and that was a really big eye-opener for me at that time in my life, was to go, oh my God, as an empath, I had been picking up on all these energies. Well, I had been there for 3 years, right? So going back to Phil at the pub, and we were discussing why these spirits were doing what they were doing. At that time I wasn't aware there was curses on the land, but the spirits were very prevalent in that town, and the influences of that they had on all the people that were there were really heavy. You could see the sadness and the depression, you could see the anger and the addiction of all these individuals that were living in this small town. And I had moved in there in 2010, and they went, welcome. You're perfect. Yeah. We'll jump in on you. And at that time in my life, I was going through a lot of problems with addiction, and my aura and my chakras had been really compromised. And again, that's why, they in spirit, they would have looked at me and gone, yay, let's have a go with this one. And funny enough, moving into a caretaker's house. You know what I mean? So, and they used to prepare the bodies in my lounge room before they buried them, which I didn't know when I bought the home. So Phil and I would have these late night discussions around what was happening. And one of the interesting things that he had brought up, which I found so fascinating just recently, when my teacher had brought this in to my awareness, in relationship to my friend and my mum who still live in Kowtowie, was the Aboriginal spirits there not having the permission, where you're not taking, the permission granted from them. And Kowtowie is interesting because the water tables are very high there, and there's a lot of salt content in the water tables. And he would attribute the really high spirit activity to the water tables. and how that conducts electricity and actually allows the spirits to sustain their energy in spirit around that town. And it was one of the things that they were drawn to in spirit. So from a spirit physical point of view, there's certainly a relationship between the energies of the land, the ley lines, dragon lines, and how the water tables work, the conductivity of the water tables, and how they actually facilitate spirit's energy. One of the interesting things when we start to understand how people, when they do cross over to the other side, it's still an energy, and it's still an energy exchange. And those that are willing to pass over and move towards the light will actually receive that light and that energy as they progress. Those that stay discarnate and close earthbound are looking for sources of energy to sustain, let alone influence those that are still incarnate in the body. They're not ready to cross over, they're there to influence. Now both forces of light and dark work to serve us. And as I said before, the dark ones will walk beside us. And if we're lucky enough to become aware of that, as all you individuals are, I would imagine that they become an instrument of our evolution and growth, if we are strong enough to be able to work with that and release them and do what we need to for our own personal growth. So for me, my journey's been really involved in that type of stuff. And like I said, it's just opening up. Phil and I would have these late night discussions, and he would always attribute the malevolent Aboriginal curses and spirits in Kowtowie to what the white people did when they first came to Australia and settled and moved up from the coast and inland, and how they stole the land from these Aboriginal elders and people, how they abused them and murdered them and left them there on that land in spirit, very angry, violent, and not happy. So they were looking for ways to influence the people that were still there. So one of my friends, Ben, who's still there with a young family, had came to me a few weeks ago. At 36, he had been through a lot of the experiences I had been through with drugs and alcohol. His business is right next door to my old house, interesting enough. And he had hit flatline, he had hit rock bottom. Business struggling, family struggling. He felt like he had just had a gaping hole in the centre of his chest, and he didn't know where to go. And the only person he could turn to was me. He thought of me. So he gave me a ring up and explained to me where he was at. I looked at him clairvoyantly, and I could see that there was these influences happening with him, but at the level that they were happening, I'm not at that level of skill or adept to be able to deal with them. So the blessing in my life is my teacher. So I've gone to my teacher and asked her to go and have a look at him. So one of the interesting things, she comes back, as I'll share with you a bit later, she had seen Aboriginal curses on the land and on the people, and he was actually carrying one of these curses that was influencing him and his business and his health and well-being emotionally. So as we opened that up for discussion, it took me back to the discussion that I was having with Phil at the pub, and why these influences were happening to those people that were living in town, why these spirits were in the pub, and the dark forces that were influencing people there, the malevolent forces. Again, he attributes this back to the spirits, the Aboriginal spirits of the land, and how that permission was not granted, and how we didn't honour the land, and they've then sent forth curses and energetic boundaries and energetic influences on the people that are still living there. One of the things that I experienced while I was there was that. So my teacher had gone in and done work with Ben and removed those curses, with my mother, and the same thing. One of the interesting things, as I was just going through my notes today, when we find that there's curses placed on the land, there needs to be a removal of these curses and the work with the spirits that are actually responsible for them. And then the land needs to be cleansed and crystal gridded. Because the relationship between spirit and Mother Earth is very sacred. And each one of us that pass over, or the indigenous spirits, knows the relationship quite personally and intimately. And it's not theirs, but it's shared. And so the land needs to be rejuvenated and blessed and gridded to make sure that any other influences do not step in and cause the negative influences that they have done. So one of the things that I was explaining to Ben, and in his financial situation, he was not doing very well, so I jumped on that a few weeks ago and went, right, I'll go get the crystals for you, I'll consecrate them, I'll bless them, and I'll energise them, and I'll send them to you. You need to place them at 4 corners of your house and one in the centre underneath the house. Luckily enough, it was a transportable, so he could get underneath and put the crystal in his home. With specific instruction, he was able to set up the grid around his house and protect the home from any other influences. Interestingly enough, he was seeing spirit moving through his house a lot as well. With 3 young children, you can imagine how distressing it could be. And not knowing what to do as a clairvoyant, seeing them there. He didn't feel like they were malevolent or harmful, but again, these spirits were influencing his family and his children emotionally and draining him energetically. And this is where he had landed. Flatlined, big hole in his chest, no purpose, getting up and struggling, no energy every day to try and run a business that was, you know, not doing so well financially, family struggling. So all of these things I started to look at and think, okay, there has to be something more in relationship to, is it just us that can create a life where our life becomes so chaotic and full of problems and issues, or is there something else outside of that? Can we actually be influenced from the other side by these forces? And the answer is yes. One of the interesting things that came out of this at 36, I'm 44 now, so this journey of recovery and opening up to all of this has been over the last 8 years. But at 36 I had reached my pinnacle of drugs and alcohol. My life flatlined. I lost the house, my business, all my possessions, my inheritance. And at some point within all that madness, I knew there was something else influencing my life, but I couldn't put my finger on it. One of the things that I felt intuitively prior, just after that happening, I moved out from my home. I had no choice. One person that had stepped up in my life was Phil's brother-in-law, his wife's brother, that lived right across the road in another old dilapidated home, who had been and is still very much under the influence of a lot of dark spiritual forces, and offered me a room there. So there I resided, and at that time was time to get on with it and change my life. I had hit rock bottom, but I didn't know what to do. 13 years of a relationship with very addictive substances was quite hard to break, and I tried to leave and I was pulled back to that place 3 times, and I felt that that was the negative spirits and influences that were actually responsible for that, because wherever I did go for help, everything just went to shit. And it was almost like these forces were so powerfully in play in my life that they did not want to see me recover physically, or let alone energetically and spiritually. So within all of that, after 3 attempts of trying to go and get well, I've come back, and intuitively I kept getting this thing, you need to go to Adelaide. There's a bookstore you have to go to. There's someone you need to see. So I did, I acted on it. And this bookstore was called Cosmic Pages. And I took my young son with me at the time. Very little money, you know, mess. So I've gone in there, and this psychic, one of Adelaide's really prominent psychic clairvoyant mediums, had just come rushing up to me from the back of the store and had pulled me from the front of the store right over to this cabinet and had showed me these crystals. And one of the stones that she pointed out to me for protection was a Brazilian stone that I can struggle to pronounce, but I still have it, and it's encapsulated in clear resin. And so I feel that you need this stone, or it was another clear quartz stone that had been cut specifically and faceted for protection. And I resonated with the Brazilian stone, and was in the back of my mind counting the money in my back pocket, thinking I don't have a lot of money to buy this, but I really need to. She said, I need to speak with you. You're surrounded by a lot of dark energy. I can see you completely immersed in dark energy from my heart center down, and it's imperative that you get in touch with me. My whole body lit up. Oh my God. This is the reason why I had to come here. Intuitively felt that I needed to connect with someone, and Spirit had appointed that for me, and she knew. So from that moment, she would read from the bookshop, but she didn't want her boss to know what she was doing, and so she slipped her phone number into my son's hand and said, give this to your dad when you get home and have him call me. So we've made the trek home, and Gabriel's given me the number and said, the lady we saw at the bookstore said to call her. It's really important that you do that, Dad. So I let it go for a few days, and I've rung her up. And we've had a discussion around this. She said there's 7 dark forces that are around you. And there's 7 entities, discarnate, malevolent entities, that are influencing 7 people around you. And it's almost like this evil has stepped in to physical form. And they are overshadowing these 7 people around you. At that time in my life, you can imagine sort of how I look. The people that I was associating with and my behaviour was really less than good. And the people that I was associated with as well were very not quite, pleasant people, to say the least. So immediately my mind raced to these 7 that were around me. And she had described how the influences from these dark forces were actually pointed at me, and how they wanted to see me fall. Not just physically, but spiritually. They wanted to actually pull me apart and disintegrate me energetically. And at that moment, I remember the fear that shot through me, and I was really terrified as to what to do. And I didn't understand what was happening and why this was happening to me. I just felt this wave of desperation come over me. And she reassured me and said, don't panic. This is why they've sent me to help you. So we continued the discussion for about an hour and a half over the phone. And she gave me the guidance and the people I needed to see and the work I needed to start doing metaphysically to sort all this shit out. My head was spinning. I've just lost everything. My life flatlined, and now you're telling me that 7 people that I know want to see me fall and ruin me, and I got to go and do this work? Are you kidding me? I couldn't believe it. I was astounded. Some of the information that she gave me, funnily enough, was how these spirits and these energies actually work. The room that I was living in Peter's house, was right by the main road, and right at the corner of the house where the room I was staying had a transformer box for the power lines, high voltage power lines. And she asked me if I was staying in a room close to high voltage power lines, and I said, yeah, actually I'm an electrician. And I was like, yeah, actually I know, yeah I am. She said, you need to move away from that immediately. These energies and these forces use that electromagnetic field as a means of being able to conduct and energize themselves to influence us. Interesting enough, when 5G steps out, that's how a lot of these forces are going to actually start to step in. And those that are responsible for this communication network know this. If you guys aren't aware of that, be aware of it. And there's specific objects that you can get from an individual on the sunny coast that you set your home up with these things and you wear them, because we're going to get hammered. Alright, so very important to be aware of that. EMF, high electrical voltage, it's the electromagnetic fields and the magnetic conduction that allows these forces to actually step in and influence us in different ways. And we might pick up and find that some days we're good, some days we've got cracking headaches, aches in our body, emotional disturbances, and yet outwardly in our lives, things are all good. Home's good, money's good, relationships are good, but these occurrences step in and we think, what's going on? I believe that that's the influences from these forces, and that's one way that they can actually step down and come in and start influencing us. So I moved out of that room to the back room as far as I could, away from that. We just had set my room up, and here's me going, what do I do? And she's telling me, so at Sage, the incense and trying to raise the vibration in the room, you know, trying to just start to imagine and create a bubble of light around me. What's grounding? What's that? How do I do that? Why is that important? How do I repair my aura? What do I need to do? So all of this stuff started to come into my focus, like, because these spirits were not only physically around me looking to come and see me fall, but they were also in spirit doing the same thing. Goodness me. She sent me to a priest down south where he actually blessed me and removed these. He was a retired bishop. She gave me his name and sent me down there, which he interviewed me, being the way Catholics bloody do things, coming from a Catholic background myself. So anyway, I was really humbled and thought, am I going to get through this interview? Am I going to be lucky enough to get help from some spiritual power that can help me get out of this mess? So after about half an hour in a discussion, he decided that he would be happy to try and remove these curses that were on me. At his very limited understanding, which I found there, which I can see looking back with the teacher that I have now, he did his best to do so and placed a blessing on me. And I walked out the door remembering everything's good. I'm going to be okay now. Okay. Was not the case. Returning back to Kowtowie, the forces that influenced me magnified. The people around me started physically threatening me, coming to Pete's home and doing all sorts of kind of, you know, horrible things. And I was really frightened and distressed. But in the back of my mind, I knew that it wasn't just these people's minds and personalities themselves, it was these forces that had stepped in that were influencing them. And the people that I was associated with were very much people that were under the influence of drugs and alcohol and had been for a long time. And so they had diminished their capacity energetically to ward off these dark influences and forces, and they had opened a sign above their head going, open, come in, welcome. So I relate this back to part of my journey through drugs and alcohol being very important, how it's taught me the importance of how to look after myself today on every level, physically, emotionally, mentally, energetically. One of the things that we do or can do, those two things will compromise us energetically and a big need to do them. The other thing is the lower vibrational emotions that we have. The masters speak about this all the time, and one of the reasons I believe why they talk about this and why we need to learn to overcome them, or at least keep them in check, is because the power of the lower emotions can actually rupture the chakras and the protective webbing on the chakras to the inner world and the auric field. It can cause holes and tears, which then you only need the smallest hole in your auric field for a spirit, an entity, a being, a creature to step through and connect and start tapping you and influencing you. The bigger the holes, the tears occur in your auric field, they then move in to your chakras. And I'm not sure if you're aware, pranic healing has taught me, is each one of us, or each one of our chakras has a webbing on the face of it. And that webbing is a protective mechanism from our inner worlds. So the chakras are spinning wheels, the meaning of the word. One spins clockwise, one spins anti-clockwise, drawing in life force energy and expelling all the used up energy. And they're very crucial to our well-being and our mental and emotional health. So when we start to cause disruption and problems in that webbing, they rip and they tear. These spirits now present in our astral fields have another opportunity to step into another room of our house and inside of us. And if any of you have gone through life and have suffered with emotional disorders, anxiety, mental problems, science and Western medicine would have you hammer that it's all one level of a problem. I like to attribute it to the problems and the influences from spirit through my own experiences, and they can be corrected, and I have seen it done, I have experienced it, and I've researched it to know. As a healer, my own experiences in life And just recently what I've observed and been a part of with my mother and my friend, Ben has made a miraculous recovery in the space of 3 weeks after we've done the removal work and the clearing work for him. And I'm mentoring and guiding him back now and showing him what he needs to do. And I told him, you have to make a choice, man. You cannot live 1 foot in either world anymore, because this will reoccur. Big light bulb went off. I am ready to take responsibility for my life. I am ready to take responsibility for my actions. I am ready to do the work to change what I need to change. Because he hit that level, right? And bang, the eyes open. Now, how interesting that would be for each one of us if we were actually had a life and experience to that level in nature, right? So again, going back to Peter's house and where I was, here I am in this room, still being influenced by spirits in Kowtowie, dark forces. The curse on the land from the Aboriginal spirits were influencing me. Empathically, I'm picking up all the information and disturbances from my mother, who was highly distressed over my state and well-being, who, in the second half of this, I'll just run you through a list of influences that have been influencing her, which were all energetically and telepathically being communicated to me as well. So not only did I have those forces of influencing me, recovering physically, empathically getting overloaded and downloaded by my mother's shit from spirit as well, and waking up I can't even describe how I was feeling. It was so horrible. Each day I dreaded waking up and facing that day and trying to get through this. But the answers were slowly coming, and for that I was super grateful. And I would do the work that I could possibly, that I could do. I had met another clairvoyant and some other spiritual people in Adelaide who I connected through reading as well, and both intuitively led there and guided to these people who, appointment by spirit, were working for me to bring me out of this darkness and into the light. Excuse me. And so they were teaching me the basic energetic techniques of how to start repairing my energy and keeping these spirits and these influences at bay, not only from just around me but where I was living. So I went through the processes of doing that, not really understanding what I was doing, but trusting and believing that that was happening. Things slowly started to improve. 8 months later, I had broken the habit and I was given an opportunity to move up north to Morayfield with an auntie, or at least a visit. That was supposed to be 2 weeks. I never went back, and I've been in Queensland since late 2014.
Good place to be.
I know. Really, really good place to be. It was exactly where I was supposed to be. So again, appointment by spirit, I was removed from there. I had learned, or was beginning to learn, what this metaphysical world was, what spirit was, what my guides were, the angels, dark forces, how they had influenced the people that I was with, how I was empathic, and all the energy. It was started to open me up. It was an amazing journey to move up here. So moving up here, my experience with spirit started to shift. I was still carrying a lot of these forces in my energy fields, and I was still experiencing mental issues, uncontrollable thoughts, uncontrollable emotions, anxiety, distress, worry. All these things I still attributed to me taking one step at a time, trying to re-establish my life, my body, my energy, my spirit, but moving forward in the world with really not knowing where I was going. It was one step at a time, from one person's house at a time, a few weeks at a time. But I was seeing the magic of spirit and guides and how they were looking after me. And that part of my journey was a journey of surrender and trust and humility, because I certainly wasn't living in that place in the past. So later, as I moved from the sunny coast down to Brisbane, I started meeting people who were clairvoyant mediums. I was attending the churches at Boundary Street, at Salisbury, and I started to learn even more about what was going on. And it was at that point that I realised that all the events that had led me to there were the events that were going to give me the opportunity to actually start to do the work and teach and heal others and bring that information out and let people know what's going on. You know, and interesting enough, today I've been invited to speak in front of you all and share part of my journey and what's been involved with me reaching this point. I no longer suffer from anxiety. I'm calm and still in my mind. I can drop into my meditations beautifully. I'm fixed, I'm focused, I'm grounded. My physical world is safe and secure. I have money in the bank. Opportunities are opening up for me now. I'm blessed and I'm grateful for all the experiences that have brought me to this moment in my life. But again, if it wasn't for those forces that were chained beside me, walking forward as I was moving through the dark night of my soul and suffering tremendously, that I wouldn't be here today speaking in front of you, let alone understand all of this. So it's interesting when we start to look at life in our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with spirit, whether it be we have an interest for people that have crossed over to the other side and we want to connect and contact our loved ones, know they're okay, or that they're there guiding and working with us and supporting us. Whether it's that, or whether we start to work with some of these other forces and assisting people in that process to clear and heal and understand what's going on. Whether it's as a psychic, a medium, or a clairvoyant, and working with guides and higher angelic beings. Or whether it's working with the Devic kingdom, closely related to Earth, and healing Mother Earth and her energies, and shutting down these portals and these dark influences that continue to wreak havoc on the Earth plane. It's really important, I feel, and with the way things are changing today, each one of us has a responsibility to ourselves and our spiritual journey and our integrity. And one of the ways we could do this and combat these forces is to actually get, if we feel that we do need help, is to seek that help and allow and get these things to be removed. It can be done, absolutely can be done. If you feel at any point that you're being influenced by other things outside of your own self, emotionally, physically, mentally, seek that help and that guidance. Your life and how you feel and think and behave quite possibly will change dramatically. So a good part of my life with this has been learning through all those processes with spirit, all the things that I had suffered, went through on a physical level, emotional, mental level. Today I stand in this place in front of you very balanced, very focused, calm, and I understand so much more than I ever would have if I hadn't had the opportunity to do that. And I'm someone who likes to believe that my life is by design. So my higher self, along with the guides and the beings that work with me before I come in, set this up in a framework. And that's part of my evolutionary job at that soul level, is to come in and learn this for this lifetime. This is what's going on. And you will be responsible for learning that, and then you will be responsible for helping others learn and also helping them heal. To step up into their light and into their power. And it is all about energy and power, as you all are aware, and the evolution of our consciousness. But how would we ever grow and evolve if we didn't have these forces working beside us and for us? For a long time I believed the opposite, and I felt as though these forces were just out to see me fall, and I was a victim and I was powerless. And they've actually enriched my life, and they've actually empowered me, and they've actually taught me to come into the true nature of who I am and why I'm here, part of the reason of why I'm here. And again, standing here in front of you all today and having the opportunity to talk about this is confirming that for me. It's a wonderful opportunity to do that. So one of the last things I'd like to talk about and just bring into your awareness is if that any of you sitting here today have ever felt deeply distressed on an emotional level, a mental level, physically, and you can't pin it down, I would give you credence to consider that you may be influenced or being influenced by other forces, and to investigate that. Because personally, I do not feel from my own experiences in life that from a very young age that was all my doing. I did for a long time, but today I don't stand there and I do not believe that I was doing all of that. One of the things that I like to describe to people today is to become the silent observer and watch yourself and what's going on. Very, very, sharply. Pay attention. That's one of the ways that we can start to discern if there are these forces influencing us. And we all, at some level, do have entities, creatures, some forces at some point chained to us and with us, working for us and with us. I'm a great believer in the people that you see with deep psychological issues, schizophrenia, mental issues. They have been severely compromised energetically. And the two chakras that sit here, the ajna and the forehead, the crown, have been so compromised that these forces have gotten into their inner worlds and have overrun their minds and their consciousness. And they hear the voices and see the imagery and have the erratic behaviour behind that, stricken by fear because these forces have stepped in and have been allowed to do so. The interesting thing around this is that I also believe that we're contracted, and I'm sure most of you would understand around contracts and how that works. So I do feel that when we come in, we have contracts in relationship to other people, and we also have contracts in relationship to spirit. It goes both ways, right? So most people that I've discovered or I've been talking to only sort of move the contract forward to people, not so much backwards to spirit, because they're still evolving as well. Now, whether they're serving and working through the shadow and the darkness, they are still evolving and still serve a very significant purpose in the evolution of life and consciousness. So if we choose to work with light, we choose to actually serve and work with the darkness as well, because in that they are there. It's both ways. The hardest thing that I have found through this journey for me is fear and not understanding what's going on. I'm so big of understanding. I'm very kinesthetic. Kinesthetic is that word when I am learning. I'm a very physical movement learner. But again, I'm someone that says I need to understand what is actually going on. So I love to investigate as much as I possibly can. And if there are people that can open those doors up for me and actually help me understand, I'm there. So again, I just would like to remind each and every one of you, I imagine all of you are super aware and very interested of what goes on the other side. But today's discussion is around these type of forces and entities, and after the break, I'd like to share with you what some of these forces are and how they influence us. I'll share with you the forces that were sitting in my fields of energy and my mum's. And I'll also talk and share with you how my teacher actually went in and removed them and moved them onto the light. Okay?
Great.
Okay, great.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.